You've been working in the same office for years, telling yourself, it'll be better next week. It didn't work out again. You've witnessed the company's illogical decisions and even felt sabotaged. Stop. If this video popped up, it's no coincidence. The sunk cost fallacy. Let's start with a project that half the office is still working on, even though it was supposed to be finished 3 weeks ago. Behind this disconnect lies a significant bias in the way your brain makes decisions. The sunk cost fallacy makes you think that the time, effort, and money spent in the past shouldn't go to waste, even if walking away is still an option. But the reality here is simple. The time, money, and effort you've spent are gone for good. What matters is how many more resources you'll spend from here on out, and whether this project is still worth it. When you recognize this trap, ask yourself, if I were starting from scratch now, would I still invest in this project? Yet the manager in the office adds another month, reasoning that months have already been spent trying to improve the project. No one asks whether the project will actually work, because this is where a cognitive dissonance arises. People don't want to admit that a project they've poured months of effort into is actually a mistake. Confirmation bias. People may selectively evaluate information around them to align with a conclusion they've already reached. In particular, they more easily notice evidence that supports their own views, while, strangely enough, they may overlook evidence that creates inconsistencies or challenges their thoughts. Moreover, this isn't limited to inexperienced people. Even intelligent people can fall into the same trap by selecting evidence that supports their own ideas. For example, a team member proposes a new workflow. The other 5 team members say it creates too many steps. However, if the employee believes their idea is correct, they may focus solely on a minor detail that supports their proposal rather than objectively evaluating these criticisms. This is where critical thinking comes into play, because what matters is not just finding evidence that supports your own idea, but also honestly evaluating evidence that contradicts it. To break this bias, make it a habit to actively seek out evidence that contradicts your own viewpoint. Negativity bias. 10 people on a team are praising the same presentation. One person, however, says the visuals are too small. Guess what kind of feedback the presenter receives? Yes, you're right. For every positive comment, at least 5 negative ones come pouring in. This is the negativity bias. When the brain encounters negative information, it tends to perceive it as more important and more urgent. Employees label it the problematic slide and focus all their attention on fixing it. Moreover, when other employees focus on the same point, it creates a social proof effect. Once a few people start saying the same thing, it becomes easier to believe there is a problem. What they don't realize is that critical thinking requires evaluating the whole picture, including 10 positive comments, rather than getting stuck on a single negative one. Because reality isn't about a single criticism overshadowing all the success. When you recognize this bias, weigh all the feedback you receive together, not just a single negative comment. Hyperbolic discounting. It means choosing a few minutes of comfort now and creating trouble for tomorrow afternoon. Let me explain. For example, you have an employee who needs to submit a report by Friday. On Monday, they have plenty of time. On Tuesday, they need to clear out their inbox. On Wednesday, they're handling a few more small tasks. By the time Thursday rolls around, they haven't even gotten halfway through the report. This is because the brain may perceive immediate comfort as more appealing than a larger future responsibility. This is exactly where hyperbolic discounting comes into play. The small, immediate comfort is chosen, while the future stress appears farther away and less significant than it actually is. How do you think this report will turn out? When you find yourself taking this shortcut, break the big task into smaller parts and set a concrete goal for each day. The halo effect. Others, on the other hand, create an air of strategic alignment right from the start, with a straight posture and a perfectly tailored jacket. The halo effect is when a single positive trait of a person leads us to evaluate their other, unrelated traits positively as well. The brain trusts the person in the room who looks stylish or speaks fluently more easily. Since critical thinking is turned off at this point, instead of evaluating the idea itself, we begin to evaluate the impression created by the person presenting the idea. Yet the reality is simple. Dressing well, speaking with confidence, or appearing charismatic does not prove that the idea being put forward is correct. It merely creates a memorable image of the person. When evaluating an idea, forget the presenter for a moment and look only at the argument and the data. Overconfidence bias. In this case, people tend to overestimate their level of knowledge, certainty, and control compared to reality. Consider this. The project owner set a deadline 2 weeks ago. The legal department hasn't reviewed it yet. The supplier still hasn't responded. The technical team has used phrases like, "We need to look into it," yet the deadline is marked in bold on the company calendar. When delays occur, everyone acts surprised. The problem here isn't just making a wrong estimate, it's failing to adequately account for the uncertainties at hand. When critical thinking is lacking, people become more prone to viewing the limited information they have as certainty. So reality sometimes shows that writing a date on the calendar doesn't mean it will actually happen. But this is where the fallacy begins. If one of the previously given dates worked out, people assume the next one will definitely work out too. Overconfidence, in turn, prevents a person from taking precautions. When a plan is drawn up by someone who isn't aware of how quickly time passes, each week that follows becomes even more hectic. When setting a date, list 3 things whose answers are still unknown and include them in your calendar. Anchoring bias. Here, the first statement in a conversation carries an unfairly large weight. This leads to the anchoring bias. Even if the first number or idea mentioned is arbitrary, incomplete, or exaggerated, thrown out without much thought, it can pull subsequent evaluations toward it. The company states a specific amount first. The candidate states their own request. However, since the first number has already created an anchor in the mind, the evaluation of subsequent offers is shaped around that number. However, an illusion of choice may arise here, because the choice made has been unconsciously influenced by the initial figure. Even if the company has the final say, the figure mentioned at the beginning of the conversation may have already shaped the candidate's expectations. When you hear the initial figure, ask yourself, if this number had never been mentioned, how would I have evaluated the same offer? The bandwagon effect. This kicks in when people in the room confuse popularity with validity. If the majority supports an idea, individual doubts begin to seem less like sound judgment and more like social discomfort. Imagine a leadership meeting. The director really likes the new platform. The second manager immediately agrees. When the third says, "I have a question mark," everyone turns to look at him. This is where the social proof effect kicks in. People may set aside their own doubts by accepting the majority's decision as correct. This can even influence the way we think, because a person may see conforming to the group's decision as safer than standing outside the group. So none of them brought this up at the meeting. When everyone quickly agrees, take a minute to jot down your own doubts on a piece of paper, then say them out loud. Self-serving bias. In this line of reasoning, when a campaign yields good results, it's attributed to flawless planning. When it yields poor results, however, it's attributed to the unpredictability of the market or unfortunate timing. Self-serving bias involves taking credit for a large portion of the success, while attributing the blame for failure to external circumstances. A salesperson boasts about their skills after winning a major client, but when business takes a turn for the worse the following month, they blame the customer list. For example, when targets aren't met, a manager on the team discovers that there are implementation issues within the team. External factors are indeed important, but the reality is that personal effort also plays a significant role in the outcome. This bias is as consistent as a calculation that would raise suspicion. Praise is credited to the individual. Responsibility, however, is marked as return to the sender. When evaluating an outcome, account for both your own contribution and the contribution of external conditions with equal honesty. Status quo bias. And finally, the bias that keeps outdated software, nonsensical chains of events, and highly talented people who have been stuck in jobs they've disliked for years in place. Status quo bias makes the current situation feel safer simply because it's familiar. An employee sees a better position, reads the job description twice, and closes the tab. The commute might be longer. The new manager is a stranger. The current job is frustrating, yes, but at least these frustrating situations occur according to a predictable schedule. So another year slips by under the comforting slogan of, maybe after the next performance review. Over time, this situation can turn into a sense of learned helplessness. Even if a person knows change is possible, they begin to believe that trying won't make a difference. Sometimes, it's the discomfort of being stuck in a rut. That's why your mug is still sitting in the kitchen of that job you don't really like. Companies have their own versions of this too. A team might stick to a 7-step approval process because that's how we've always done it, even though 2 of the approvers left years ago, and one of the steps exists solely to copy information between the same forms. Changing the process requires a meeting, and this very process has already led everyone to harbor deep skepticism toward meetings. When you consider making a change, don't focus on the risk. Instead, imagine where you'll be a year from now if nothing changes. Your brain isn't deliberately misleading you. It's using mental shortcuts, and some of these shortcuts could cost you a promotion, a raise, or a job you should have left years ago. But what if you recognize these shortcuts and challenge them? Then you can make much more informed decisions, open new doors in your career, and reach your true potential. The good news is that once a shortcut is named, it becomes easier to question it. Pause for a moment before clinging to an old investment. Look for evidence that contradicts your assumptions. Ask yourself whether the first in effect is truly warranted, or if it's just arriving early. So, which one sounds most familiar to you? Name the shortcut you use most often. And there's always one bias missing from the list. You've probably noticed it before we did. Let's discuss it in the comments.